In this episode of Humans of Reliability, we are interviewing Sean Goedecke, staff software engineer at GitHub. On top of being a great software engineer, Sean is also an excellent writer whose stories are often trending on Hacker News. In this episode, Sean is sharing how he used LLMs to write code, when not to use them, and how to go around their mini issues. Okay, so Sean, can you share with us how do you use LLMs, more specifically when you are writing production code, and where do you draw the line between using AI and coding yourself?
Yeah, the distinction production code there, I think, is a live distinction because the code that I am paid to write for my job, a big percentage of it is production code that will end up in production, but not all of it. Some of it is test code that ends up like in the production service but not run in production, and some of it is experimental code that is used to gather data and make decisions, but not actually part of a production service. So when we're talking about code that's going to be run in production, I almost never get large language models to write a big block of code for me. That basically never happens. It's either in very small chunks from something like Copilot autocomplete, or it's used for kind of research. So for autocomplete, I use Copilot, and a lot of that Copilot autocomplete goes into production code. But I only accept an autocomplete when I know exactly what I want, and it's just a matter of having the computer type it out for me. It doesn't actually make decisions. Maybe one in 50 or 60 times, the model will produce something that I didn't quite expect, but is still along the lines of the sort of thing I want, and I'll say, yeah, that's fine. That's basically what I had in mind, even if it's not word for word. But usually it is word for word or token for token. So it's autocomplete, and then the other big thing is chat. And I use chat a lot for never to like write code from scratch, but either to kind of talk about my approach before I start writing code, or to kind of sanity check my approach once I'm finished writing code. So one thing I'll do pretty often is I'll paste a function or a few paragraphs of code into a chat box, and I'll say, does this look reasonable to you? And more importantly, does this look idiomatic to you? I don't use this a lot when I'm in my comfort zone. I use it mostly when I'm outside my comfort zone. So for instance, I feel very comfortable with Ruby on Rails. That's sort of my happy place, I guess. And I don't ask like LLM chat to tell me if something is idiomatic, because I know whether it's idiomatic or not. But if I'm working on, for instance, something in Golang, which I have been paid to write, and I've written a lot of production Golang, but it's certainly not something I'm as comfortable in, I will occasionally ask, hey, is this idiomatic Go? Or if I'm writing C, which again I have been paid to write, but it's not something I'm as comfortable in, I'll ask, is this idiomatic C? So I find that this kind of chat-based flow helps me become more broad in areas where I'm like not as familiar, but doesn't necessarily help me become more deep in areas where I consider myself already a specialist. Why do I use LLMs in this kind of restricted way? Like, it's because in my experience, the big problem when you're writing production code in an existing large app is knowing where to make your change and how to make your change specifically. And that, I think LLMs are still pretty bad at. It's hard to take like a 5 million line code base. Where can I add this new functionality? Where should I add this new check? Like right now, the LLM doesn't really know where to do that. That might change like in the next 6 months. And then I think the way I interact with LLMs to write production code will change dramatically.
Yeah, so it sounds like we should invite you again to be a guest in 6 months so you can keep us posted on how you adapted to the rapid change. So I mean, one way that's very interesting, like one way to reframe what you said when you said, hey, like, depend how the code is going to be used. I mean, either way, it goes to production in some ways, but one way is like kind of a one-off thing, and it cannot really cause an outage, right? Like, it's like, hey, I'm going to, parse this data, I query it, do something with it, and then it's done. But the other one, we are looking at a longer timeline, right? Like where it goes in a service, and it might stay there for years or more, and then, this code might cause issue and outage and incident. So that's another way to see that. So you wrote about this on your blog, and by the way, I really encourage the audience to check Sean's blog. It's a main goal. It's really good. You are a really talented writer. And in this article where you speak about how you use LLMs, you mentioned that sometimes you want to be careful. And I think you touched base a little bit on that already, but you say, hey, sometimes I don't want to use LLM because I don't know what I'm missing. Can you expand a little bit on that?
This point applies the most in areas that I'm less familiar with. And writing C was a great example of this. I haven't had to do it for a while, but there was a period at GitHub where I wrote a fair amount of C. And that's perfect because it's the perfect storm of code that gets run a lot. I won't give specific details, but since it was in C, you can assume that it was performance sensitive code that had to run in the hot path. And C, of course, has a lot of ways to shoot yourself in the foot and cause problems and cause outages. So yeah, like when I say I don't know what I'm missing, what I mean is like I don't know the kind of thing that an experienced C programmer might catch, but I might not catch, that leads to a memory leak or some kind of like low-level problem that kind of compounds over time and maybe in 6 months, maybe in 5 years causes a problem. Using a large language model is very helpful, but it's not the kind of help you get from an experienced colleague because they don't have the subject matter expertise and they don't have like skin in the game. You know, they're not making a commitment to you. They're like giving you an idea. It's like asking advice from like a smart friend who's like really uninvested in your problem. Like right. It's very useful, but at the end of the day, like you're responsible for the code you're putting into production. And if you don't know like enough to be confident in that, you need to go and like get an actual person at your company to review the change who is a subject matter expert, which is what I did when I had to write C a lot, and which is what I typically do when I have to go into areas like C# or Go or different frameworks and kind of use the LLM to get 80% or 90% of the way there.
Right. So calling a friend is the how to mitigate that. And yeah, I see the value. If you have an issue with the code and your coworker helps you here, if it breaks and you are on call, you'll be, hey, how about you come help me? Speaking of friends, so I used to be in education. I created a software engineering school, and one of the things we were teaching our students was to use rubber duck, where when they were stuck on something or debugging, that's really an industry classic. And we thought as a junior software engineer, it's a good tool to have. So now, do you think LLMs are kind of the modern version of the rubber duck?
Well, if they are, I would say the many hundreds of billions of investment is probably going into the wrong spot, because a rubber duck debugging is just, you can open an empty file in Vim or a Notes app and have the same experience. I will say I have had rubber duck experiences with LLMs where in the process of typing out my problem and explaining my prompt, it has become clear to me what the solution is without the LLM even needing to provide anything. So like, and LLMs do, like, to interact with them, you have to type out your problem, which kind of forces you to like have that rubber duck experience. Yeah. So in that sense, yeah, like it is, but the duck's not rubber. Like the duck quacks. You do get responses out of it. You do get input from it, and I do think that is the main value I get from LLMs. It's not just having to write down my problem. It's getting an actual solution that I might not have thought of.
So now, like, let's dig maybe a little bit. How do you use LLM when you are troubleshooting and fixing bugs?
The first line answer to that is that I don't. When I fix a bug, I try and fix a bug myself. I don't I'll reach to LLMs as like the first choice when I'm maybe architecting some new piece of code as like an initial talk, or when I'm writing something that I know what it's supposed to do, the LLM will like complete it for me. But when I'm fixing a bug, the way to fix bugs is to understand the system. And LLMs, like, you can't just one shot a solution out of an LLM and then get to an understanding. Like, you have to be the one to understand the bug. So it's not as useful for that as a first pass. What I do use LLMs for when I fix bugs is as a kind of last resort check. So if I've spent, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes looking into a bug and I'm still very confused, what I'll do sometimes is I'll package everything up, a log of what I've done, the current state of the code. I'll ship that off to like GitHub Copilot Chat or some LLM that can look at my proprietary code without me getting in trouble, and then basically just say, can you see the solution? And people might have different experiences here, but in my experience, it either one-shots it or it doesn't. I've had like almost no luck with like iterating on it and trying to talk it through. And if the LLM is confused, trying to unconfuse it, I've had no luck with that. Like it either gets it immediately, which is great, or it just never gets it. So this is sort of like a one and done thing I sometimes do when I'm debugging. Basically, I'll be like, man, I'm stuck. Let me just see if the, GPT 4.0 or 0.1 can get it. And then if it can't, I go back to trying to solve it myself.
Interesting. I don't know if you've seen, I think it was last week, there were like a tweet trending, not promoting, but like coining the term vibe coding. And vibe coding, you've seen that, but I'll share it for those who didn't see it. It's basically coding without touching the keyboard, tell the LLMs what to do. And then if there is a bug, you don't even try to understand it. You don't even look at the code. You say, hey, like, take this code, put it in there, try something else. And then you grow a code base without, seeing any of the lines, which, like some people are like, that's fun. And the author was like, yeah, I use this for weekend projects. But then a few days later, I saw someone saying, hey, like at HubSpot, they're hiring software engineers and they are not allowed to code. They can just prompt LLMs. So, I mean, it is happening. Is it working? I don't know. Is it the future of coding? I think for sure, and at least in some capacity. Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting. So now let's talk a little bit more about humans of reliability. Is a lot about system conversation. Most of our audience is SREs. I think most of the tools, LLM tools, are really geared towards code base. And you spoke a little bit of this about the context is really important. Do you think that LLMs, if they are given the right context, they could help SREs to troubleshoot outages?
This is a really interesting question. I think the answer is yes, with a lot of asterisks on it. So why do I say yes? They can think in a way that's useful to engineers. If you give them a problem, they can solve it. They may not think as well as like a strong engineer, but I've been on call for many years. If I get paged in the middle of the night, I am not a strong engineer, at least not immediately. I'm a tired, confused, vaguely panicky, that's exactly the state in which like an LLM might be able to think better than you or kind of help you think, or not get in your way because like you're still spooling up. So like LLMs, can they compete with like strong engineers? Maybe not. I don't think that's the case yet. Can they compete with people who've just been paged out of their bed at like 3 a.m? Yeah, probably. Yeah. That's why I think they can help. Why I think they can't help is 2 points. One, it's the thing I said earlier about fixing bugs means understanding the system. For that, like a person has to like do that, and a person in an incident especially has to take responsibility, has to kind of step up and be like, I'm making this change. I think it's going to have this effect. Like it's a lot of trust to put in an LLM to do that in like a high pressure situation. The thing about incidents is that there's a million things happening. There's so much information coming in usually, and the trick is to kind of filter that out and figure out like what's worth focusing on. And LLMs are great, but the problem with working with LLMs is very similar, that they give you this flood of information, and the trick is kind of filtering out what's worth focusing on from that. So I kind of worry that if you just take an LLM and you plug it into an incident like a chatbot, it's just going to make the core problem of incidents worse for the poor SRE who's trying to pass out what's worth focusing on already. So yeah, in principle, yes, I can see why it would be useful, but there are big problems you would have to solve before I think it would actually make people's lives easier.
Yeah, I really like the idea of, hey, like, yeah, when you wake up, let's say it's 3 a.m. and you are like, you are in a dream and you wake up and site is down and you're like, oh, dang. There is definitely, as you said, like a time where you are like kind of not ready yet. So the LLM could help you to gather information and kind of come up with some hypothesis to get you going. So last one, thank you for sharing all of this. It's super interesting. What are your top 3 favorite LLM powered tools that you would recommend to our listeners?
Well, First, a disclaimer, like I've worked for GitHub for the last couple of years. I worked on GitHub Copilot for a year. So a lot of this is going to be biased towards the tools that I have used a lot, which have been GitHub Copilot-like tools. So yeah, not being paid to say any of this, but this is sort of where I'm coming from as somebody who's worked on and has used GitHub Copilot a lot. So the first tool is GitHub Copilot completions. Like I use completions all the time. When I use personal projects, like I make sure I have completion set up on them. It just saves me a bunch of time in really obvious ways. And then next up, like any kind of chat. So for me, it's Copilot chat, but I think you could use ChatGPT, you could use Claude, you could use anything for this. Just the chat interface to like paste in context and then ask questions and iterate on a solution. I think like ironically, like chat, I think is still kind of underrated as an as an interface for development work. It's not. It's probably not the long-term future, but I think it's better than people give it credit for. And then the third is like API access. So I use GitHub Models for this, which is GitHub's free LLM API access. But again, if you have an open AI key or anything, I think people don't write exploratory scripts enough in AI as a tool. One example I'll give is recently I had to categorize like a few thousand public PRs. As part of some feature I was working on, I had to tag them as like whether they contained a large language model prompt or whether they didn't. I did this in like 15 minutes with a script that called out to GPT-4o, and that's a superpower. That's something that just straight up was not possible to do 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So yeah, 3 tools: Copilot completions, any kind of chat, and then any kind of API access for writing throwaway data gathering scripts.
Nice. Yeah. Personally, also never used any API endpoint, so definitely something to think about. And yeah, you haven't heard many of this, so sounds like a lot of us might be missing out on this. Sean, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. If we want to get in touch or see some of your work, like where can people find you?
Thanks for having me. You can find me on LinkedIn, which is just my whole name. Or you can go look at my website, my blog, which is, again, mywholename.com. So SeanGoedecke.com. I guess go to the show notes to see how to spell Goedecke.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Have a good one.
You too.